At 2:17 in the morning, a bomb went off inside Harlow Veterans Medical Center in Tucson, Arizona, and the East Wing became a wall of fire and screaming. Armed men in black tactical gear poured through the smoke before the alarms finished sounding. Security was down. The backup generator hadn't kicked in. Soldiers who had survived overseas were trapped in hospital beds, helpless, and the staff was running in every direction. Then a blonde nurse stepped out of the dark hallway, cracked open a locked emergency cabinet, lifted a rifle with both hands, checked the chamber in under 2 seconds, and moved toward the threat like she had done it 1,000 times before. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A young orderly pressed himself against the wall and whispered, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. She was already gone. Before you find out who she really is and what she was hiding inside that hospital for 2 years, hit subscribe right now and turn on your notifications. This channel drops stories like this one every week, stories that will keep you up at night, make your jaw drop, and remind you that the most dangerous person in the room is sometimes the one no one ever bothered to look at twice. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. Mess. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and she had worked the night shift at Harlow Veterans Medical Center for exactly 22 months. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with pale hair she kept pulled back tight and gray eyes that didn't give much away. She wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of nurse who made jokes during long shifts to keep morale up or stayed after her hours chatting with the day staff. She did her job, she did it correctly, and she went home. That was the whole of it, as far as anyone could tell. The hospital sat on the edge of a federally secured military installation outside Tucson, which meant its patient population was almost exclusively active duty personnel, veterans recovering from combat injuries, and the occasional classified admission that nobody asked questions about. It was not a soft posting. The staff rotated fast. People burned out, transferred out, or washed out within a year. The ones who stayed were either tough enough to handle the weight of what came through those doors, or numb enough not to feel it anymore. Claire Whitmore had stayed. What people noticed about her, if they noticed her at all, was that she was careful. Methodically, almost stubbornly careful. She double-checked medication dosages that other nurses signed off on in 30 seconds. She flagged equipment irregularities before they became problems. She remembered which patients slept on their left side and which ones woke up swinging if you touched their shoulder without warning first. She was the kind of nurse who slid into a room at 3 a.m. to check on a patient who wasn't technically her responsibility just because something felt off. That carefulness, which should have looked like competence, had been rebranded by her supervisor as a personality defect. Dr. Vanessa Cole ran the ICU and the trauma unit with the kind of aggressive certainty that came from being the smartest person in most rooms she'd ever entered. She was 41, board-certified in trauma surgery and critical care, and she had very specific ideas about what a military hospital needed from its staff. She wanted fast, loud, decisive action. She wanted people who projected confidence even when they were running on fumes and guesswork. She wanted, in her own words, fighters. Claire Whitmore, in her professional assessment, was not a fighter. "You second-guess yourself too much," Vanessa had told her during a performance review 6 months earlier. Not unkindly, exactly, but not gently either. Vanessa didn't do gentle. In a trauma environment, hesitation costs lives. I've watched you. You go quiet when things get loud. That's a problem. Claire had looked at her across the desk and said, "I've never lost a patient to a decision I made in this hospital." "Yet," Vanessa said. That was the end of that conversation. The other nurses on the night shift had a more casual version of the same opinion. Claire was too quiet, too strange, too closed off to really trust in a crisis. She wasn't unfriendly, she just didn't connect. She didn't let anyone in. She showed up, worked her shift with precision that sometimes bordered on unsettling, and disappeared. What none of them knew, what no one in that hospital knew, was that Claire Whitmore had been assigned to Harlow under a name that was not entirely her own, with a background that had been carefully constructed to be unremarkable. She had not always been a hospital nurse. She had not always been someone no one paid attention to. But that was a different life, and she had spent 2 years being very good at not thinking about it. The night of the attack started like every other Thursday night shift. Claire came on at 11, signed off on the handover from the evening charge nurse, and began her rounds. Ward C had 14 patients, 3 post-surgical, 4 in various stages of recovery from blast injuries, 2 on monitoring for traumatic brain injuries, and 5 she could recite from memory with their entire medication schedules, sleep patterns, and the first names of their families. She knew that Sergeant Darren Polk in bed 7 had a daughter named Lily, who called every Sunday morning, and that he cried quietly after she hung up, and that he would deny it if anyone mentioned it. She checked his IV line first, as she always did. He was asleep. The hospital was quiet. By midnight, she had completed her first full round and was halfway through updating charts at the nurses' station when she noticed the third power fluctuation in 40 minutes. It was subtle. The lights dimmed for less than a second, barely enough to register, and then everything came back. The other nurse on duty that night, a young man named Danny Ruiz, who was 26 and 3 months into his first real hospital posting, hadn't looked up from his phone. Claire set down her tablet. "Danny," she said. How many times has the power done that tonight?" He looked up. "What do you mean? Did something flicker?" She counted back. 3 times. Once at 11:40, once at 12:08, once just now. Danny glanced at the lights, which were burning steadily. "Probably just the grid. It's been hot this week. Brownout territory." "It's not a brownout pattern," she said. "Brownouts hold. These are drops and recoveries. That's not grid instability." He stared at her for a moment. "You want me to call facilities?" She thought about it, held the thought, turned it over. "Not yet," she said. "I'm going to check the eastern corridor." Danny watched her go with the mild bafflement of someone who had learned to simply accept that Claire Whitmore sometimes did things for reasons she didn't explain and was usually right about whatever she was watching for. The eastern corridor connected Ward C to the administrative wing and the secondary generator room. It was a long, fluorescent-lit hallway that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and floor wax, wide enough for 2 gurneys to pass each other without trouble. At this hour, it should have had exactly 2 people in it: the security guard who did the 11 p.m. through 3 a.m. perimeter walk, and the facilities tech who checked the boiler room every hour. The hallway was empty. Claire walked its length slowly, listening. The ventilation system hummed. Somewhere far down the line, a door was not latched properly. She could hear the faint rattle of it shaking in the airflow. She found the security station at the corridor junction. The monitor bank was on, showing feeds from all 12 exterior cameras. She stood in front of the screens for 40 seconds, studying each one. On camera 7, covering the east service entrance, she saw a van parked at an angle that blocked the frame's corner. The van had been there on her last pass. It was still there. The engine exhaust was still visible in the thermal overlay, which meant the engine was still running. A parked van. Running engine. 12:43 a.m. She reached for the radio on the desk to call the base security office. The line was dead. Not staticky, not busy. Dead. Claire put the radio down, and for the first time in 22 months, something very old woke up behind her eyes. She walked back down the corridor at a pace that was not quite a run, turned into the supply access hallway, and stopped in front of the gray metal cabinet mounted beside the emergency fire suppression panel. It was regulation equipment, standard for any facility on a secured military installation. A locked emergency response cabinet containing 2 rifles, 1 sidearm, 4 loaded magazines, and a medical trauma kit. The cabinet required a biometric scan and a 6-digit override code. Claire entered both from memory. The cabinet opened. She took the Heckler & Koch G36 from the bracket, checked the chamber, indexed the magazine, confirmed the safety, and slung it across her body with the practiced, entirely automatic motion of someone who had done this particular sequence of actions so many times it lived in her hands rather than her brain. She was back in the Ward C corridor before Danny had registered she'd been gone longer than usual. He looked up. His expression went from mild to completely blank when he saw what she was carrying. "Claire, get everyone off the floor," she said. "Every patient who can be moved, you move them to the interior rooms. Anyone on a ventilator or IV push, you leave in place and you lock the room from the inside. You do not open that door for anyone except me. You got it?" "What's... Danny?" She said it quietly, and something in her voice stopped him completely. "I need you to do that right now." He nodded. He got up. He didn't ask another question. She was already moving toward the east wing. The explosion came at 2:17 a.m. It wasn't the east entrance. It was the generator room, the secondary generator, which meant whoever had set it knew exactly which system to take out first. The primary grid flickered and died 30 seconds later, and the hospital went dark except for the emergency lighting, which kicked in on battery power, dim red-orange strips along the floor, enough to see shapes in, not enough to see faces. Claire was already in the eastern stairwell when the blast hit. She felt it through the floor and walls before she heard it, a compression wave that rattled her teeth and blew a fire door off its hinges 20 feet away. She pressed herself against the stairwell wall and waited for the secondary debris to stop falling. Then she heard the footsteps. Multiple sets. Coordinated. Moving fast but not panicked. Professionals, not opportunists. They were coming up from the service level, which meant they'd come in through the basement access. She counted the footsteps. 4 distinct patterns. Possibly 5. Claire climbed 2 flights and came out on the 3rd floor, which was the direct approach to the ICU and the critical surgery suite. If they wanted casualties, they'd come here. If they wanted something specific, or someone specific, they'd come here too. She moved through the dark with a sureness that had nothing to do with the emergency strips on the floor. She knew this building. She had spent 22 months learning it the way she used to learn terrain, not for the sake of being a good nurse, but because she had never fully stopped being what she was before. The first attacker came through the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor. He was in tactical black, carrying a suppressed submachine gun, moving with the kind of practiced quiet that told her immediately he was trained. Not militia, not a threat of opportunity. He'd done this work before. Claire was already in a doorway alcove. He passed within 8 feet of her. She let him pass, tracked 2 more entering behind him, waited until they were committed to the corridor, and then she moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes would later be described by the 3 surviving members of the attack team as something they could not fully reconstruct, not because they were concussed, though 2 of them were, but because the speed and the decisiveness of it didn't fit the template of what any of them had been briefed to expect from a hospital, from the staff of a hospital. Claire put the first man down with a controlled strike that didn't require her to fire. She had his weapon before he hit the floor. She used it to cover the next 10 seconds, drove the second attacker back through the door he'd come from with 2 shots that were careful enough not to go through the walls into the patient rooms. The third went for the radio on his vest, and she closed the distance before he keyed it, which was the most important thing. The most important thing was always to keep them from calling numbers she didn't know about yet. 4 minutes. Then the corridor was quiet. Claire knelt beside the first attacker, checked his vest, his earpiece, the frequency on his radio. She pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, locked, but she noted the model, the case design, the scratch pattern on the upper corner. She stood up. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. Down the corridor, a door cracked open an inch and a pair of eyes appeared, wide, white-rimmed, terrified. A corpsman from the night surgical crew. She didn't know his name. He'd rotated in 2 weeks ago. "Are they—" he started. "Get back in that room," she said. Not harshly, calmly. "Lock it. There may be more." He disappeared. The lock clicked. She keyed her own radio, personal frequency, not hospital issue, and said quietly, "This is White. Harlow is compromised. Repeat, Harlow is compromised. 4 tangos down, possible additional units unaccounted for. I need a full containment perimeter, and I need it now." Static. Then, after 3 long seconds, a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years came through the receiver. "White, confirm your position." She closed her eyes for 1 breath. "3rd floor ICU corridor," she said. "And Marcus, you need to get here fast, because whoever sent these people knew exactly where to hit this building, and I don't think they're done." A pause. Then Colonel Marcus Hale said, "We're 12 minutes out." 12 minutes. She looked down the dark hallway, at the shapes on the floor, at the emergency lights painting everything the color of old blood. She went to find the rest of them. At 3:04 a.m., 4 military vehicles came through the main gate of Harlow Veterans Medical Center, and the soldiers who came out of them moved with the kind of authority that made the base security personnel, who had been scrambling to understand what had happened to their communications, stepped back and let them work. Colonel Marcus Hale was the first through the hospital's main entrance. He was 53, built like someone who had spent a long time carrying weight and then put most of it down, with a face that was all angles and very little softness. He walked with the economy of someone who had never once moved his body without a reason. He surveyed the lobby. The emergency staff huddled near the backup communication station, the shattered glass from where the secondary explosion had cracked a window panel, the two base security officers who looked like they'd been hit by a truck, and said to no one in particular, "Who's the senior medical staff on site?" Dr. Vanessa Cole stepped forward from the cluster of people near the nursing station. She had a cut above her eyebrow that she had not yet dealt with, and her scrubs were torn at the shoulder. She had apparently come down from the 3rd floor at some point during the chaos, which told Hale something about her. "I am," she said. "Dr. Cole, ICU and trauma." "What is happening?" "I have patients who need evacuation, and I can't get a coherent answer out of anyone." "Your patients are secured," Hale said. "3rd floor containment is active. We need to talk about your staff." She blinked. "My staff?" "Specifically," he said, "a nurse named Claire Whitmore." Something moved across Vanessa Cole's face. Confusion. And underneath it, a beginning edge of something she didn't quite have words for yet. "She's on night shift," Vanessa said slowly. What does she have to do with... Where is she?" As if answering the question herself, Claire came through the stairwell door at the end of the lobby. She had left the rifle upstairs. She walked into the light with her hands visible and her face the same quiet, unremarkable face she wore every night of the week, except that her scrubs had blood on the sleeve and her jaw was set in a way that made everyone in the lobby take a half step back without consciously deciding to. She stopped when she saw Hale. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You look terrible." "You're 12 minutes late," she said. "I said 12. 14. Traffic." It was not a funny joke. Nobody laughed. But something passed between them that was not quite humor and was not quite grief. Something that existed in a register that required years to develop and could not be explained quickly. Vanessa Cole stood between them, looking at Claire Whitmore with an expression that was working very hard to reconcile two completely different people into one face. "What is this?" she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. Not weak, just recalibrated. "Who are you?" Claire looked at her. "I'm the nurse on the night shift," she said. "Same as I've been for 22 months. "That's not..." Vanessa stopped, started again. "I watched the security footage, the Eastern Corridor. You moved like someone who knew what they were doing," Claire said. "Like someone who's done this before." A silence settled over the lobby. The ambient noise of the emergency, the distant PA system, the murmur of personnel on radios, the hum of the backup power system, continued underneath it, but the silence between the three of them had a specific weight. Hale spoke. "Dr. Cole," he said, "I'm going to need to ask your staff to clear this area for the next 2 hours while my team processes the scene and secures the building. My patients are being monitored. I have a trauma physician and 2 critical care nurses from base medical who are already on the floor." He said it with a finality that was not unkind but did not invite negotiation. Vanessa looked at Claire for another long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I told you that you weren't cut out for this kind of hospital." "You did," Claire said. "I was wrong. It was not an apology. It was too early for that, and Vanessa was not the type to apologize quickly. But it was the beginning of something honest, which was more than Claire had expected from her at 3 a.m. in the aftermath of a firefight. She nodded once. Hale put a hand at Claire's elbow, not grabbing, just redirecting, and said, "We need to talk, now." "I know," she said. "You made contact on the personal frequency." "Yes." "Which means you had the equipment. Which means you've been..." "Yes," she said again. He exhaled once sharply. "How long were you planning to stay invisible?" She looked at him. Something moved through her gray eyes that wasn't quite tiredness and wasn't quite relief. "I thought," she said, that maybe forever was an option. He walked her toward the secured briefing room at the back of the administrative wing. Around them, his team moved with efficient precision through the lobby, and the hospital staff watched them go, and no one spoke. In Ward C, Sergeant Darren Polk was awake in bed 7 because the explosion had jolted him out of sleep, and he had spent the last 40 minutes listening to the sounds of the building being brought back under control. He had reached for the call button 3 times, and each time put it back down, because he'd spent enough years in the field to know when a situation was being handled. At 3:21 a.m., the door to his room opened quietly, and a nurse checked his IV line and took his pulse and wrote something on the chart at the foot of his bed. She was about to leave when he said, "You the one who took care of it?" She paused at the door. "Sleep, Sergeant Polk," she said. "That's not a no," he said. She turned off the light and closed the door. He lay in the dark and thought about his daughter, Lily, who would be calling on Sunday morning, and decided he wasn't going to tell her about tonight. At 3:44 a.m., in the secured briefing room 2 floors below, Colonel Marcus Hale spread a series of photographs across the table and waited for Claire Whitmore to look at them. She looked. The photograph showed 3 things: the van from camera 7, the phone she'd taken from the first attacker, and a face she recognized immediately. A face she would have recognized in any light, in any context, under any name he chose to use. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough for Hale to catch it, because he had known her long enough to read the things she didn't put in her face by accident. "You know him," he said. She looked up. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Intercepted communication, 6 weeks ago. We've been tracking the network since then." He paused. "We didn't know you were here, Claire. I want to be clear about that. If we had known, you would have pulled me," she said. "Yes. And I would have been right back where I started." A silence. "The man in that photograph," Hale said carefully, "is connected to your last deployment, the one that ended your service." "I know who he is." "Then you know this attack was not random." She looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she set it down, face up, on the table. "They weren't here for the hospital," she said. "No," Hale said. "They were here for me." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Outside the window, the desert sky was beginning to shift from black to the deep blue that came just before dawn, and somewhere in the hospital above them, a monitor beeped steadily in the rhythm of a heart that had survived the night. Claire Whitmore pressed both hands flat on the briefing table and looked at the photograph of the man who had sent those people into the building where she had spent 2 years trying to become someone ordinary. Her hands were not shaking, but they were not still either. Her hands were not shaking, but they were not still either, and Marcus Hale had known her long enough to understand that the difference between those 2 things was the only measure of cost she would ever allow anyone to see. He gave her 30 seconds. That was the most he'd ever given anyone in a briefing room, and he'd learned to give it to her specifically because the alternative, pushing before she was ready, produced nothing useful and damaged something he couldn't name but recognized as necessary. She straightened, put her shoulders back. The photograph stayed on the table, face up, and she didn't look at them again. "Tell me what you have," she said. Hale pulled the chair across from her and sat down without ceremony. One of his intelligence officers, a compact woman named Sergeant First Class Daria Voss, who had said nothing since entering the room, opened a laptop and angled it so Claire could see the screen. 6 weeks ago, we intercepted a communication channel that had been dormant for 3 years, Hale said. The encryption architecture matched a network your unit dismantled in 2021, which told us it wasn't dismantled as completely as the after-action report suggested. Claire said nothing. The communication referenced a target. No name, coordinates only. He nodded at Voss, who pulled up a map overlay. Those coordinates resolved to this building. Harlow, which at the time we interpreted as an institutional target, military hospital, symbolic value, accessible enough to be viable for a mid-tier operation. He paused. We were wrong about what they were after. You were looking for a what? Claire said. Not a who. Yes. She exhaled slowly through her nose. And the phone I pulled off the first attacker. Voss rotated the laptop toward her. We've been running it since you called in. The device has been in contact with 3 relay nodes over the past 72 hours. 2 of those nodes are in Mexico, The third is in Tucson. How far from this building? 4 miles. The number landed in the room and sat there. 4 miles meant active. 4 miles meant this wasn't a team that flew in, hit a target, and left on a plane. 4 miles meant infrastructure, support. Someone on the ground who knew the area, knew the building, knew the schedules. The man in the photograph, Claire said, Victor Raskov. How long has he been in the country? Hale and Voss exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but Claire caught it. We don't know that he's in the country, Hale said carefully. That's not the same as saying he isn't. Another pause, shorter this time. We have a possible sighting in El Paso 14 days ago, Hale said. Unconfirmed. Claire looked at the map on the laptop screen. El Paso to Tucson was less than 300 miles, a comfortable day's drive, the kind of distance that required planning but not logistics. He's not directing this from overseas, she said. Probably not. Then he's within reach. Hale leaned forward. Claire, I need you to understand something before this conversation goes any further. He said it carefully, which was unusual for him. He was not a careful speaker by nature, which meant when he chose his words slowly, it was because the situation required it. You are currently a civilian employee of this facility. You have no operational status. What you did tonight in that corridor, I know what I did. What you did tonight exists in a legal and procedural gray area that my office is going to spend the next several weeks sorting out, and I need you to let us do that without Marcus. He stopped. Am I in trouble? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. No. Then tell me what you actually need. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. The gesture she remembered from years ago, the one that meant he was about to say something he didn't want to say. I need your history with Raskov. Complete. Not the version that's in the official record, because I've read that and it's got more gaps than content. The actual version. The room was quiet. The ventilation system ran. Somewhere distant, she could hear the sound of his team moving through the building, the occasional radio call, the systematic sounds of a scene being processed. She thought about the 2 years she had spent building a life that fit inside the perimeter of this hospital. The routines, the charts, the patients who got better slowly, and the ones who didn't. Sergeant Polk's Sunday phone calls. Danny Ruiz learning to trust her, read on situations, even when he didn't understand it. She thought about the locked cabinet in the supply hall, and how she had never once in 22 months opened it for anything other than checking that its contents were intact. She thought about the fact that she had counted the footsteps in that stairwell and felt, not the cold adrenaline of fear, but something warmer. Something she hated to admit was almost like relief. The feeling of a skill that had been held in stasis finally being used for what it was built to do. She hated that feeling. She had spent 2 years trying to extinguish it. Victor Raskov, she said, was the procurement broker for a weapons network that moved modified anti-personnel ordnance across 4 countries between 2018 and 2021. I was part of the joint task force that built the case against the network over 18 months. We closed 3 nodes and seized enough material to generate a sealed federal indictment. She stopped. The 4th node was supposed to close at the same time. It didn't. Hale was very still. Someone tipped the 4th node, Claire said. Raskov pulled his people out 48 hours before the operation. 3 members of my unit went into a building that should have been occupied by Raskov's logistics team and was instead occupied by 11 people with very specific instructions about who they were looking for. She let that sit. 2 of my teammates didn't come out, she said. Hale said, That's not in any report I've read. No, she said, it isn't. Who buried it? That's the question I've been sitting on for 3 years. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It had texture, weight. Hale looked at the map on the laptop screen, and then at the photographs on the table, and then at Claire Whitmore with an expression that was recalibrating in real time. Someone inside the operation fed Raskov the timeline, he said slowly. Yes. And you think, I don't think, she said. I know. I've known for 3 years. I came here to disappear because the alternative was trying to prove it without the resources to prove it, and the people who could give me those resources were the same people I couldn't be sure of. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You thought it might be someone in my chain of command." She met his eyes. "I thought it might be someone in anyone's chain of command, including yours." It was not an accusation. It was the truth, and they both knew it, and the fact that she said it directly instead of around the edges was its own kind of statement about what she thought of him. He nodded once, slowly. "And now?" "Now," she said, "Raskov sent a team into a hospital full of wounded soldiers to pull me out of hiding, which means 3 years of whatever I built here is over, and I have 2 choices. I disappear again, or I finish it." "And which one are you choosing?" She looked at the photograph of Viktor Raskov's face on the briefing table. "I need access to the communication intercepts," she said. "All of them, from the beginning of the 6-week window. And I need the El Paso sighting data." Hale looked at Voss. Voss looked at Claire, and then at her colonel, and made the particular face of someone who was calculating legal exposure in real time. "Sir," she said carefully, "Ms. Whitmore is technically—" "I heard you," Hale said. "Get her the files." Voss hesitated for exactly 1 second, then turned to her laptop. The sun came up while Claire worked. Hale brought her coffee at some point, bad coffee from the hallway machine, in a paper cup that left a ring on the corner of the folder she was reading, and she drank it without commenting on the quality. He sat across the table and went through his own files in parallel, and they worked in the way that people work when they have spent long hours in close quarters before and don't need to fill the silence with conversation. By 6 a.m, the hospital was operating on partial capacity with Hale's medical team supplementing the night staff. The patients in Ward C had been returned to their rooms after the building sweep confirmed no additional threats. Danny Ruiz had, according to the brief report she received, handled the patient evacuation efficiently and without panicking, which she noted and filed away. At 6:47 a.m., Dr. Vanessa Cole appeared in the doorway of the briefing room. She had cleaned the cut above her eyebrow and changed into fresh scrubs. She looked like someone who had not slept, which was accurate, and like someone who was working very hard to project a certainty she wasn't fully feeling, which was less usual. "They're telling me I can't access 2 of my own patients," she said to Hale. "Correct?" Hale said. "Temporary restriction pending. I'm their physician." "I understand that." "No," she said. "I don't think you do, because if you understood it, you would not be blocking me from my own ICU." She said it with the sharpness that was her default register, but underneath it Claire could hear something that was less like anger and more like disorientation. The sound of someone who had spent 24 hours discovering that the building she thought she understood had been operating on a completely different set of rules. Claire looked up from the files. "The 2 patients under restriction are in rooms 304 and 309, she said. "Corporal Anders and Lieutenant Mares. They're restricted because the attack team's secondary target, if there was one, would have been either a high-value patient or a staff member with specific knowledge. Until we confirm which, we can't have anyone going in or out of those rooms without vetting." Vanessa stared at her. "You've been here for 22 months, she said. "Yes." "And you've been—" "What? Exactly. This entire time, what have you been?" Claire looked at her steadily. "A nurse, genuinely. Everything I did on this floor, every patient I cared for, every chart I updated, every time I flagged a medication discrepancy or sat with someone at 3 a.m. because they couldn't sleep, that was real. I wasn't performing it. But the other thing was also real. A beat. Both things can be true." Vanessa stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she said, "Can I at least get updated vitals on Anders and Mares?" Hale nodded to Voss, who pulled the monitoring data and handed it across. Vanessa took it, looked at the numbers, exhaled with what was probably relief that neither patient had deteriorated overnight, and left without another word. The door swung shut. Hale looked at Claire. "She's not as bad as you think," Claire said. "I don't think anything about her." "You made a face." "I don't make faces." She returned to the files. He returned to his. At 8:15 a.m., Voss received a transmission that made her sit up straight in her chair. Claire was 3/4 through the Intercept archive and had already identified 2 patterns that the original analysis team had missed, not because they weren't capable, but because they hadn't known what to look for. The communication structure Raskoff used had a signature, a tell in the timing gaps between relay bounces, that she recognized from 3 years of living inside his network's architecture. It was like a fingerprint that only showed up if you knew the hand. "Colonel," Voss said. Hale looked up. "The Tucson relay node," Voss said. "It just went active." The room went from tired to alert in less than a second. "Active how?" Claire asked, already on her feet. "It's transmitting. Short burst, 60 seconds, then dormant again." Voss was typing fast. "We've got a location. It's—" She stopped, read the coordinates again, looked up. "It's on the hospital grounds." The 3 of them looked at each other. "They left someone behind," Claire said. Not a question, a conclusion, delivered without inflection, which was somehow more alarming than if she'd said it with urgency. Hale was already on his radio. Claire was already at the door. "Whitmore," he said sharply. She stopped. "You are not operational," he said. "You wait here." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the look of 2 people who had been in this specific argument before, in different buildings, in different years, and both of them knew exactly how it ended. "The hospital grounds," she said, "cover 11 acres. I know every maintenance access point, every blind spot in the security camera coverage, every exterior door that doesn't log properly in the system. Your team has been here for 6 hours. A long pause. "You stay in radio contact," he said. "You do not engage independently." "Understood," she said. She was already moving. The transmission had originated from the service yard on the hospital's north perimeter, a fenced maintenance area that housed the backup fuel tanks, the HVAC equipment for the east wing, and a small equipment shed that was theoretically accessed twice a week by facilities staff for routine checks. The camera covering the north yard had been one of the 12 on the security monitor bank in the corridor. She hadn't flagged it during her initial assessment at 12:43 a.m. because it had shown nothing unusual. She was thinking about that, about what she'd missed and why. As she moved along the exterior wall toward the north yard, with 2 of Hale's soldiers covering her flanks at distance, the equipment shed was padlocked. The padlock was new, not the brand that facilities used. Different color, different weight. The kind of mistake someone made when they were working fast and assumed no one would check. She signaled to the soldiers. They moved into position. She hit the shed door with her shoulder at the same moment one of the soldiers took the padlock with a bolt cutter, and the door swung inward. The interior smelled of solder and heat and the particular chemical note of recently used electronics. There was a folding table along the far wall. On it, a portable relay transmitter, mid-range, commercial grade, the kind that could be purchased without generating a flag on any monitoring list, connected to a car battery and a timer mechanism. No person. The shed was empty. But the transmitter was still warm. She crouched in front of it without touching it and looked at the timer. The transmission window had been 60 seconds, as Voss had identified. The next window was set for... She looked at the clock on the mechanism. 40 minutes from now. "Voss," she said into the radio, "the relay is automated, timer-based, not human-operated. Whoever set this up left before the attack." Hale's voice came on the channel. "Can you pull the transmission log?" "Working on it." She leaned in. The transmitter had a basic log display. She read it off. 14 transmissions over the past 72 hours. The first was 3 days ago at 0300. She paused, reading further. 12 of them are status pings, standard check-in protocol, but the last 2... She stopped. "Whitmore." "The last 2 transmissions were sent during the attack window," she said, "but not before. During." Silence on the radio. "Someone was monitoring in real time," she said, "and sending updates." "Updates to who?" She looked at the transmission log again. The outgoing addresses were encrypted, but the structure of the relay chain was visible if you knew what to look at, and she did. She traced the first hop, the second, the third. On the 4th hop, the chain didn't route outward to Mexico or across a border. It terminated locally, inside the city of Tucson, on a residential block about 2 miles from Harlow's front gate. Marcus, she said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended. I think the person who was receiving those transmissions was watching this hospital from a very comfortable distance. She stood up. And I think they're still watching. The next 6 hours were the kind that didn't feel like hours. They felt like a series of compressed incidents with no air between them, each one requiring a response before the previous one had finished resolving. Hale's team ran the residential address. It came back clean. A rental property, 3-month lease, paid in cash through an intermediary. The tenant had registered as a corporate consultant from out of state. The name on the lease was real enough to pass a basic check. Driver's license, a sparse credit history, a LinkedIn profile with 87 connections, and no activity since it was created. The kind of identity that was built to survive a surface search and collapse under anything deeper. They hit the property at 10:40 a.m. and found it empty. Recently empty, coffee still warm in a cup on the kitchen counter, a window open in the back bedroom, a cot in the living room with a depression in the pillow that suggested it had been used in the last 12 hours. They also found, taped to the inside of a closet door, a printed photograph. Hale sent Claire the image from his phone without comment. She looked at it for a long time. It was her. Taken from a distance, with a long lens, probably from a vehicle parked on the street or from one of the rooftop parking levels of the garage across from the hospital's employee entrance. She was in her scrubs, walking to her car after a shift. Head down, bag over one shoulder, moving with the slightly too fast stride of someone who had worked a long night and wanted to get home before the morning traffic built up. She looked at herself in the photograph and tried to think when it had been taken. The angle, the light, the season of the trees in the background. Winter, she thought. 4 months ago, maybe 5. Someone had been watching her for at least 5 months. She set the phone down on the briefing table. Daria Voss, who had been going for 36 hours without sleep at this point, and was running on something that was probably past its limit, looked at her from across the table. You okay? I need the full identity packet on the tenant, Claire said. We're running it. And the vehicle. If someone was shooting photos from across the street, they were in a vehicle. Pull the parking garage footage. Already requested. Claire nodded and stood up and walked to the window at the end of the room that looked out over the hospital's south courtyard. It was a Thursday morning now, which meant the world outside was operating on its normal schedule. A maintenance worker crossing the courtyard with a tool cart, 2 nurses eating lunch early on a bench near the fountain, a van making a delivery at the loading dock. She watched the van. It was the right company livery. The driver's movements were right, unhurried, routine, the specific body language of someone doing a job they'd done 1,000 times. She tracked him for 90 seconds and then let her eyes move on. Old habits. She had spent 2 years trying to turn them off and succeeded about 40% of the time. Hale came back into the room at 11:30 with 2 things, a folder and a look on his face that she had seen before, years ago, in different circumstances, and that she knew meant the situation had shifted in a direction that was going to be worse than what they'd been working with. The identity packet came back, he said. He put the folder on the table. She opened it. The tenant's name, under the fabricated cover identity, traced through 3 intermediary layers to a source that Voss had flagged with a red tab at the top of the page. Claire read the name on the flagged line. She read it again. That's not possible, she said. The words came out before she could stop them, which was rare for her, and she heard how they sounded and didn't try to take them back. We verified it twice, Hale said. He was investigated. He was cleared. He was cleared by a process that, as of this morning, we have significant reason to believe was compromised. Hale sat down heavily across from her. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours. Claire, the man who was watching this hospital from that rental property show, the person who was receiving those relay transmissions during the attack last night. Major Ethan Kell, she said. He was your unit's intelligence liaison in 2021, Hale said. He had access to the operational timeline. He had access to the target list. He had access to everything, she said. He had access to everything. She sat down. The briefing room was very quiet. 3 years ago, 2 of her teammates had walked into a building that should have been clear and hadn't been, because someone had told Raskoff they were coming. She had spent 3 years believing it was someone above Kell's level, Someone in a senior position, someone with broader reach and better cover. She had never once considered the person who had sat across from her at planning tables for 18 months, who had handed her coffee and argued about extraction routes, and driven her to the airport on the last day, the day before everything went wrong. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Unknown," Hale said. "The rental property has been cleared out. He's in the wind." She looked at the name on the flagged page for a long moment. Then she looked up at Hale. "He knows I survived last night," she said, "which means he knows the attack failed, which means he's going to run." "Yes. And Raskoff is going to know the attack failed, which means he's either going to run with Kell or he's going to—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face. "He's going to try again," she said. "Not the hospital. That's burned. He'll pick something else." She stood up. "He'll pick something with a higher probability of success, something where he controls the variables better." Hale was watching her carefully. "What are you thinking?" She looked at him, and for a moment her expression was the same one she'd had in the corridor at 3 a.m., when she'd been standing over the men she'd put down and listening to the building settle around her. Not cold, not distant, focused, in the particular way of someone who had just finished calculating something and arrived at an answer they didn't like but couldn't argue with. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that Raskov came here for me specifically, and that Kell told him where I was, which means Kell has been tracking me for longer than 5 months." She picked up the photograph from the table, the one of herself walking to her car, taken in winter light. "He knew my schedule, he knew my car, he knew my cover name." A beat. "He also knows that the only thing that made me stop running was finding something worth staying for." Hale was very still. "The patients," he said. "Polk," she said. "Marez, Anders, Danny Ruiz, every person in this building I've spent 2 years learning." She set the photograph down. "If I run again, those people become leverage. Raskov doesn't need to find me. He just needs to take something I won't walk away from." The room was quiet for long enough that the ventilation system became audible again. Then Hale said, "So we don't let you run?" "No," she said, "we don't." She straightened and pushed the folder back across the table toward him because she didn't need to look at the name again. She had it. It was in her now, settled in alongside everything else she'd been carrying. "I need operational reinstatement," she said. "Provisional. Enough to work with your team under your authority." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you're asking?" "I know exactly what I'm asking." He was quiet. Then he opened the folder to the back page, where there was a single form, and he uncapped a pen and slid both across the table. She was reaching for the pen when Voss knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. Both of them looked at her. Her face said what her voice hadn't yet. "We've got a problem," Voss said. "Define that," Hale said. "The parking garage footage from across the hospital. We pulled 48 hours. She held up a still frame printed from the footage. A vehicle on the 3rd level of the garage, positioned with a clear sight line to the employee entrance. Dark SUV, license plates visible. She set the print on the table. "The vehicle is registered to a fleet company. The fleet company is a subsidiary of a larger logistics firm." She paused. "The logistics firm has a federal contract." Claire looked at the still frame. "With which agency?" Hale asked. Voss looked at him, then at Claire. "Ours," she said. The word hung in the room like something physical. Ours. Hale didn't move. Claire didn't move. Voss stood in the doorway with the printed still frame in her hand and the look of someone who had been hoping, on the walk from the communications room to the briefing room, that she had made an error somewhere in the chain and that the error would reveal itself before she had to say what she'd just said out loud. No error had revealed itself. "Sit down," Hale said. Voss came in and sat. She set the still frame on the table and turned her laptop so they could both see the screen, where she had the subsidiary chain mapped out in a flowchart that was clean and precise and completely damning. The fleet company was called Meridian Transport Solutions. It was incorporated in Delaware, operated out of a Phoenix logistics hub, and on paper it moved medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies for government contracts. 14 vehicles in its fleet, contracts with 3 federal agencies, one of which was the same Defense Intelligence Office that Marcus Hale reported to. The contract is legitimate, Voss said, because she had clearly anticipated the first question. Meridian has been providing transport services for 2 years. The contract went through standard procurement. Everything checks out at the surface level. But, Claire said, but the SUV in that garage has been logged as a Meridian vehicle for the past 4 months, and it has no delivery assignments that correspond to any of its recorded movements. It's been operating off manifest. Voss pulled up a second document, a movement log with highlighted entries. 17 trips in 4 months, none of them to any facility or address on the official contract. The GPS data is there, but whoever was managing the vehicle turned off the active reporting. These entries only exist because the base system automatically archives position data at 6-hour intervals. Hale said, "Who has access to Meridian's contract management?" "I'm still pulling that. But the contract manager on our side, the officer who signed off on the original procurement and handles the renewal," Voss stopped. She looked at the name on her screen and then at Hale. "It's a Captain Lena Ferris. She's assigned to the Defense Logistics Office in Phoenix." Hale picked up his radio. He held it for a moment without keying it. "I need to know who Captain Ferris reports to," he said, "and I need to know it before I make any contact with that office." "Working on it," Voss said. Claire was looking at the still frame again. The SUV on the 3rd level of the garage angled toward the employee entrance. 4 months of trips, 17 logged positions, all within a 2-mile radius of Harlow. Someone had been building a surveillance package on her for 4 months, maybe longer, so those were just the entries that had been archived. The active reporting had been off. There could be more. "The photo in the rental property was taken in winter," she said. 5 months ago minimum, but the vehicle movements only go back 4 months. "Different surveillance setup in the early period," Hale said. "They escalated at 4 months, more resources, more coverage." "Which means something changed 4 months ago," she said. "Something that made them accelerate." Hale looked at her. "Do you know what?" She thought about it. 4 months ago. She went backward through the calendar in her head, looking for anything that had deviated from the pattern of her days here. Anything that could have triggered a change in someone else's timeline. Nothing came. And then something did. 4 months ago, she said slowly, I filed a medical incident report on a patient who'd been admitted under a classified designation. He came in through the secure intake bay, the one that doesn't go through normal registration. His injuries were consistent with blast trauma, but there were secondary wound patterns I couldn't account for. I documented what I saw and flagged it to the charge physician. What happened to the report? It got routed up and I never heard back, which is normal for classified admissions. You document and you let it go. She paused. But the patient, his paperwork had a routing code I'd seen before. 3 years ago, on a different set of documents in a different context. Hale was very still. It was a routing code from the 2021 operation, she said. The same network, which means someone ran an asset through this hospital 4 months ago, and I saw it, and I documented it, and I didn't make the connection consciously. But apparently someone decided that was too close. You were already on their radar, Hale said. The incident report was just confirmation that you might be a risk. Oh, so they started watching more carefully, she said, and eventually decided that watching wasn't enough. She pushed back from the table, stood up, walked to the window again, not because there was anything useful to see outside, but because she needed the motion, needed to move rather than sit while the shape of it assembled itself in her head. 4 months ago, a patient with a classified routing code had come through her ward. She had done her job. She had documented what she saw. She had flagged an anomaly and let it go up the chain and assumed someone competent was handling it. Instead, her documentation had apparently traveled up the chain and landed in front of someone who reported to Kell, or to Raskoff, or to whatever overlap existed between the two of them. And that person had made a phone call, or sent a message through a relay transmitter, and the machinery had started moving. 14 years of training and 3 years of hiding, and what had eventually cracked her cover was a medical incident report filed in good faith on a Thursday night shift. She almost laughed. She didn't, because nothing about it was funny, but she recognized the specific absurdity of it. Voss, she said, the patient from 4 months ago, the classified admission. Can you pull the intake record? If it's classified, I'll need a... Marcus, Claire said. Do it, Hale said. Voss typed. The record took 4 minutes to surface because it was behind 2 access gates that required Hale's credentials to open, and each gate generated an automatic notification to the originating office, which was a problem they would have to deal with later or possibly very soon depending on who was monitoring those notifications. The record came up. The patient had been logged as a John Doe with a classified operational designation. Age estimated mid-40s. Admitted with blast-related injuries to the lower extremities and 1 upper body wound that had been treated at a prior facility. He had been at Harlow for 11 days and then transferred out to a location not specified in the record. Claire read the secondary wound documentation she had filed. It was thorough. She was always thorough. And it included a notation that the wound pattern on the patient's right shoulder was inconsistent with blast trauma and appeared to be a surgically modified scar, possibly indicating a prior implant removal. She stared at that line. Implant removal. Marcus, she said, if Raskov's network was running assets through this hospital, they weren't just using the secure intake bay for convenience. They were using the medical facilities. He looked at the screen, read the line. Implant removal, as in tracking devices, communication implants, the kind of hardware that gets inserted in field assets and has to come out surgically when the asset is being transitioned or burned. She turned from the screen. Someone ran a full field extraction through this hospital's secure surgical suite. They used our facilities, our staff, our equipment, probably while their own people were managing the paperwork. And they did it right under the nose of every physician and nurse on the floor, including her. She had flagged the scar and not understood what she was looking at. She had been 12 inches away from the evidence of an active covert operation using her hospital as a logistics node, and she had written it up as an anomaly and moved on. How many classified admissions in the past 2 years, she asked. Voss was already counting. 14. Pull all of them, Claire said. Everyone with secondary wound documentation. I want to know how many of them had scar patterns consistent with implant work. Hale said, if this goes where I think it's going, then we have a much bigger problem than 1 attack team and 1 traitor, Claire said. Yes. The 14 records took 20 minutes to compile because several of them required additional access, and in that 20 minutes, 3 things happened in sequence. The first was that Voss received an automatic callback notification from the Defense Logistics Office in Phoenix, triggered by the access to the classified intake record. Someone in that office had a flag on that file, and the flag had just tripped. The second was that Hale's radio produced a signal from the perimeter team. A vehicle had been observed making 3 slow passes on the road, fronting the hospital's north gate, and it was not a Meridian SUV. It was a different vehicle entirely, newer, with rental plates. The third was that Danny Ruiz knocked on the briefing room door and came in with the expression of someone who was trying very hard to look calm and was not succeeding. There's a man in Ward C, he said. He came in through the main entrance about 20 minutes ago. He's not staff and he's not family. I checked the visitor log. He told the front desk he was a federal health compliance officer doing a routine audit. Name? Hale said. He showed credentials. Kendrick Brower, Department of Health and Human Services. Danny held up his phone, which had a photograph he'd taken, discreetly, from the nurse's station, of a man in a gray suit standing in the middle of the Ward C corridor with a tablet in his hand. The thing is, I ran the name and the credential number through the HHS verification portal the way we're supposed to, and it came back valid. Claire looked at the photograph. The man in the gray suit was standing very still in the corridor, looking at the door to room 307. He was not looking at any of the other doors. He was not making notes on his tablet. He was not doing anything that an auditor would do. He was watching the door to room 307. Room 307 was Sergeant Darren Polk. How long has he been there? Claire asked. I came straight here, Danny said. 15 minutes, maybe. She was already moving past him into the hallway. Hale was right behind her. He didn't try to stop her this time. The walk from the administrative wing to Ward C was 90 seconds at a normal pace. Claire did it in 60, which meant she was moving fast enough that the two soldiers Hale signaled fell into step behind her at a jog. She pushed through the Ward C door and came into the corridor. The man in the gray suit was still there. He turned when he heard the door and saw her, and something shifted in his posture. A very small adjustment, the kind that people trained to be unreadable made when they realized they'd been found, and that adjustment told her everything she needed to know about whether his credentials were actually valid. "Mr. Brower," she said, and walked toward him at the same steady pace she used on rounds, unhurried, nothing in her hands. "I'm the charge nurse for this ward. Can I help you?" He recalibrated. The adjustment smoothed out. He had a good face for this work, middle-aged, forgettable in the specific way that suggested effort, with the kind of professional blandness that read as official from a distance. "I'm completing a compliance review," he said. "I was told I'd have access to the ward census and patient placement logs." "Of course," she said. She stopped 4 feet from him, which was closer than he wanted her, and she knew it. "I just need to verify your access authorization with the hospital administrator before I pull those records. Standard protocol for any federal review." "My credentials were already verified at the front desk, yes, but ward-level access to patient records requires a second verification. Hospital policy." She smiled at him, which was not a warm smile, but was professionally appropriate. "It'll take about 10 minutes. You're welcome to wait at the nurse's station." He looked at her. She looked at him. Behind her, she was aware of Hale positioning his 2 soldiers at either end of the corridor. Visible, but not aggressive. A perimeter, not a confrontation. "That seems unnecessary," the man said. "It really isn't," she said pleasantly. "Patient privacy regulations require—" "I know what the regulations require." "Then you know I can't give you access without the second verification." A beat. "The nurse's station is right there." He held her eyes for another moment. She watched him calculate. The soldiers, the nurse who wasn't moving, the options available to him in a corridor he hadn't planned to be pinned in. Then he smiled back at her, with the same professional quality as her own, and said, "Of course. Happy to wait." He walked toward the nurse's station. Claire stayed where she was until he had passed her, then turned and watched him settle into the chair beside Danny's desk. He put his tablet on the surface and looked at it. She walked to Hale and said quietly, "He's not here for the records. He hasn't looked at anything except 307. "I saw," Hale said at the same volume. "He came in while your people were focused on the perimeter vehicle. That's not coincidence." "No." Hale looked past her at the man in the gray suit. "Decoy and entry, classic split. Which means whoever is driving that car out front isn't the threat." She paused. "He is. But he hasn't done anything." "Not yet." They stood in the corridor outside room 307, and Claire thought about Darren Polk on the other side of that door, who slept on his left side and cried after Sunday phone calls with his daughter, and had survived 2 deployments and a medevac and 8 weeks in a military hospital, and who had done absolutely nothing to become a pawn in a situation he didn't know he was inside. "I need you to move him," she said, quietly, "right now, while our friend at the desk is being watched." Hale keyed his radio and gave instructions at a volume the man at the nurse's station could not have heard. One of the soldiers moved to the far end of the corridor and disappeared through the door to the back stairwell. Claire walked to the nurse's station. The man in the gray suit looked up when she approached. "While we're waiting," she said, setting a clipboard on the desk in front of him, "I'll need you to sign the secondary access log. Name, credential number, and the originating office that authorized the review." He picked up the pen she'd put beside the clipboard. He was good. His hand didn't hesitate. But she was watching his eyes, and his eyes moved once toward the door of room 307 before he started writing. She noted the time he'd looked. She noted which direction the look went. She noted that he hadn't asked which room was which. He knew which room Polk was in, which meant he had either been given specific patient placement information that was not available through any public or administrative channel, or he had been in this ward before tonight, before the attack, before any of this had surfaced. She picked up the clipboard when he'd finished signing, thanked him with the same professional warmth she'd been maintaining, and walked back down the corridor. The soldier Hale had sent through the back stairwell was already inside room 307. The process of moving Polk, safely, given his recovery status, without destabilizing his current medications, would take approximately 8 minutes if done correctly. 8 minutes. She positioned herself where she could see the nurse's station and keyed her radio. Voss, I need a real-time verification on HHS credentials for a Kendrick Brower, not the portal check, actual contact with the originating office. The portal check came back valid, Voss said. I know it did. That's not what I'm asking. A pause. Give me 5 minutes. I've got 8, Claire said. Probably. The next 4 minutes were the kind that accumulated detail without resolution. The man at the nurse's station scrolling through whatever was on his tablet with studied patience. The quiet of the corridor, the background noise of the hospital doing its morning routines around the specific silence of Ward C, which had been operating under restricted access since dawn and felt like it. At the 3-minute mark, Hale appeared beside her. Vehicle out front made a 4th pass, he said. Stopped at the end of the block. Engine running. Ready to move when he signals, she said. If he signals. He will. She watched the man at the desk. He's been here 17 minutes. That's longer than he planned for. He's getting impatient. What's his move? He's going to find a reason to get up in the next 2 or 3 minutes. He'll try the room and find it empty. And we'll see what he does when he finds it empty. At the 4-minute mark, Voss came through on the radio. Brower's HHS credentials are valid because they're stolen, she said. The real Kendrick Brower is an HHS employee in Sacramento. He reported his credentials as compromised 6 weeks ago. Someone cloned them. A pause. The cloned credentials have been used 3 times in the past 6 weeks, all 3 times at federal medical facilities. Harlow was the 4th. Claire looked at the man at the nurse's station. He had set his tablet down. He was looking at his watch. Voss, she said, send that to Hale's phone right now. He needs it for custody purposes. Already sent. The man stood up. He made the motion look natural, the small stretch, the gathering of his tablet, the look of a professional who has been waiting patiently and is now going to politely inquire about the status of his request. He was very practiced. Under different circumstances, Claire would have found it impressive. He walked down the corridor toward room 307. She let him get within arm's reach of the door before she said, Mr. Brower. He stopped. The room is empty, she said. Patient was moved for a procedure about 6 minutes ago. He turned. His face was still professional, but the thing underneath had changed. She could see the edge of it now, the decision being made in real time about which way to go. That's fine, he said. I'll wait. You won't, she said. And then, evenly, Sergeant Hale. The 2 soldiers came from both ends of the corridor at the same time, and whatever option the man had been calculating evaporated before he'd finished the calculation. He didn't run. He was too good to run when there was nowhere to run to. He stood with his back to the door of the empty room and looked at Claire with an expression that had dropped the professional layer entirely and was now just assessing. You're the nurse, he said. It wasn't a question. I am, she said. You're the one from last night. That's a broad description. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said very quietly, he said you'd be cooperative if we had the right leverage. He was wrong, she said. Take him. The soldiers moved. Hale had a phone to his ear before the man was fully secured, calling in the arrest to his superior at the base command. And Claire heard him saying the words clearly and calmly. Unauthorized entry, false federal credentials, suspected connection to the previous night's attack. And she stood in the corridor of Ward C while it happened and breathed in and breathed out and thought about what the man had said. He said you'd be cooperative if we had the right leverage. He, Kell, Raskov, one of them, both of them coordinating through relay transmitters and cloned credentials and fleet vehicles with the GPS reporting turned off. They had sent someone into her ward, into the room of a patient who was there because he'd served his country and had gotten blown up for it, and whose worst problem before last night was that he missed his daughter's Sunday phone calls. She went to the nurse's station and sat down in the chair the man in the gray suit had just vacated and put both hands flat on the desk and stayed very still for a moment. Danny Ruiz appeared beside her. He had a cup of coffee, real coffee, from the machine in the staff break room, not the hallway dispenser. and he set it next to her hand without saying anything. She looked at it, then at him. "You noticed him before I did," she said. 15 minutes, he said. "I clocked him coming off the elevator. Something was wrong with the way he was moving." "What do you mean?" "He looked at every door except the nurse's station," Danny said. "Every auditor who's ever come through here, the first thing they do is find the nurse's station, because that's where the records are." He walked past it and looked at the patient rooms. He shrugged with the specific awkwardness of someone who was 26 and had just done something that mattered and didn't know how to carry that yet. "You taught me that. You're always watching the thing people aren't looking at." She picked up the coffee. "Go check on Marez," she said, "and tell whoever's in there with him to get comfortable. We're going to be a while." He nodded and went. She drank the coffee and thought about Kel. The problem with Kel, the thing that she kept circling back to and hadn't yet resolved, was the why. Not the why of the betrayal itself. She'd spent enough time in close quarters with compromised people to understand that the motivations were usually less dramatic than the consequences. Money, fear, coercion. Sometimes just the incremental accumulation of small decisions that each seemed manageable until they added up to something irreversible. No, the why she kept circling was more specific. Why now? Why, after 3 years of knowing where she was and choosing not to move, had Kel suddenly escalated to a direct attack? The incident report from 4 months ago was part of it. The patient with the modified scar, the classified routing code, the flag that had tripped when she documented what she saw. That was the trigger for increased surveillance, maybe the trigger for beginning to build the operation. But there was a gap. 4 months of watching and planning, and then in the last 72 hours, the switch from surveillance to action. Something had accelerated the timeline. She needed to know what. She took the coffee and went back to the briefing room, where Voss was still at her laptop, looking like someone running on the last dregs of everything. "The 14 classified admissions," Claire said. "Did you pull them?" "Working through them." Voss turned the laptop. 11 of the 14 have secondary wound documentation. Of those 11, I've identified 8 with scar patterns consistent with what you described. Modified tissue, evidence of prior implant work. She paused. "Claire, this goes back 20 months. This has been running through this hospital for almost 2 years. 20 months. Which meant it had started before Claire had filed any incident report, before she had flagged anything, which meant she hadn't triggered it. She had just gotten close enough to it that they noticed." "Is there a pattern in the timing?" she asked. "The admissions? Are they clustered?" Voss looked at the dates. "There are 2 clusters, 7 admissions in the first 8 months, then a 6-month gap, then 4 more in the last 6 months. She highlighted the dates. "The gap corresponds to—" She stopped. "What?" Claire said. "The gap corresponds to the period after your incident report," Voss said slowly. "They stopped running assets through here for 6 months, and then they started again. They had paused, assessed the risk, decided the documentation Claire had filed wasn't going to go anywhere, that she hadn't connected the dots, and resumed. And then the last 4 months of surveillance to make sure, and then the attack. They resumed because they needed to," Claire said. "Whatever they're moving through this hospital, whatever those patients are carrying when they come in, and what gets removed while they're here, they couldn't afford to stop permanently. The operation needs this facility." She sat down. "Which means the operation is ongoing, right now. The last admission in that cluster, when was it?" Voss looked at the screen. 11 days ago, she said. 11 days. "The patient is still here," Claire said. Voss checked. Her face answered before she did. "Room 312, she said. Room 312. Ward C, 4 doors down from where Darren Polk slept. Claire was on her feet and moving before Voss had finished the sentence, and she was 3 steps into the corridor when Hale came through the door from the opposite direction and stopped when he saw her face. 312, she said. He didn't ask. He fell into step beside her. They reached room 312, and Claire pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room had a patient in it, a man in his late 40s, both legs in compression dressings, right shoulder bandaged, vitals running steady on the monitor. He was asleep. His chart at the foot of the bed identified him under the same classified designation format as the others, a patient code, no name, admission date 11 days prior. Claire pulled on a pair of gloves from the dispenser by the door and lifted the chart. She turned to the surgical notes from his admission procedure, which she had not personally been involved in. He'd come in on a day shift with a different surgical team. The notes documented debridement of the lower extremity wounds and cleaning and closure of the shoulder wound. Standard, professional, clean, except. She read the note on the shoulder wound twice. The attending physician had documented a foreign body retrieval, a small metallic fragment, described as shrapnel, removed from the subcutaneous tissue of the right shoulder, described as shrapnel. Claire had spent years in trauma medicine. She had seen more shrapnel wounds than she could count. She looked at the scar on the patient's shoulder, the healing edge of it visible above the bandage, and at the documentation of the wound's depth and the retrieval angle. That was not a shrapnel entry pattern. That was a surgical access point, precise, controlled, made by something guided rather than propelled. And the attending physician who had documented it as shrapnel was not a physician she recognized. The name on the surgical note, Dr. P. Garrow, was not a name that appeared anywhere else in the hospital's staff records, which she had looked at because she looked at things like that because she always had. She turned to Hale. "The surgeon who treated this patient doesn't exist," she said. He stared at her. "The credential is in the system," she said, "but there is no Dr. P. Garrow on staff at this hospital. There never has been." She held up the chart. "Someone came in, performed a procedure on this patient under a false credential, documented it as routine, and left." "They retrieved a device," Hale said. "Yes, but the note says they retrieved shrapnel." She set the chart down. "Which means whatever was in there, whatever came out of his shoulder 11 days ago, is documented as medical waste from a shrapnel retrieval. It was disposed of." "Or it wasn't," Hale said. She looked at him. "If the surgeon wasn't real," he said, "then the disposal isn't real either. Whatever came out of that shoulder could be anywhere." She thought about the relay transmitter in the equipment shed, the timer, the 14 transmission windows over 72 hours. She thought about the vehicle making slow passes outside. She thought about a man in a gray suit who had come through the front door with stolen credentials and stood outside the wrong patient's room, watching the wrong door, waiting for something. "Marcus," she said, "I don't think they came here to take me." He went very still. "I think they came here because this patient arrived 11 days ago carrying something important and the extraction operation went wrong somehow. The device, whatever it is, didn't leave the building the way it was supposed to, and now they need it back." She looked at the sleeping man in the bed. "He was the distraction. I was the distraction. The attack last night, the surveillance, the man in the gray suit. Cover," Hale said, "or pressure, a way to keep us looking in one direction while—" Her radio crackled. Voss from the briefing room. Her voice was careful in the specific way it got when she was controlling something she didn't want to say carelessly. "Colonel Hale," she said, "I need you to come back to the briefing room right now, both of you." "What is it?" Hale said. A pause. The length of it was its own message. Yeah. "The 14 classified admissions," Voss said. "I've been cross-referencing the staff who treated each patient. There's an overlap I missed in the first pass because it's not in the physician records." "Where is it?" Claire said. "Nursing assignments," Voss said. "There's one staff member who is on duty in this ward for 11 of the 14 classified admissions." Claire felt something cold move through her. "Voss," she said, "the staff member is listed as the primary ward nurse on each of those shifts," Voss said. "The name on the record is yours, Claire." The radio stayed quiet after Voss finished speaking, and the quiet had a texture that Claire recognized, the particular quality of silence that followed a statement too significant to immediately respond to, the kind that required the people in the room to first confirm to themselves that they had heard it correctly. She had heard it correctly. Her name. On 11 nursing assignment records for 11 classified admissions spanning 20 months. Hale looked at her. She looked at the wall just above his left shoulder, which was a habit she'd developed years ago when she needed to think without her face doing anything she hadn't authorized. She was doing it now. She could feel him watching her, and she let him watch. "I wasn't on duty for 11 of those admissions," she said. "I know," Hale said. He said it without hesitation, which she noted and filed away. "Someone placed my name on the records retroactively." "Yes." "Which required access to the hospital's nursing assignment system, which is not externally accessible. It runs on the internal network only." Hale keyed his radio. "Voss, when were the nursing assignment entries last modified?" Voss came back in under 30 seconds. "The entries don't show modification timestamps. They were either entered correctly the first time or the modification was done at the system level. Someone with administrative access who could alter records without triggering the standard audit log." "That requires IT administrative credentials," Claire said. "Not just hospital staff credentials, someone with back-end access." "Or someone who knew someone with back-end access," Hale said. He was already moving toward the door. She followed him, and they walked together through the Ward C corridor toward the briefing room with the particular economy of two people who understood the same things simultaneously and didn't need to narrate them to each other. The man in the gray suit was being held in a secure room off the administrative wing. Captain Ferris at the Phoenix Logistics office had not yet been reached. Hale's calls were going to voicemail, which was either coincidence or something worse. The relay transmitter in the equipment shed had been collected and was being analyzed. The patient in room 312 remained under guard, sedated, stable, unaware that the thing removed from his shoulder 11 days ago had become the pivot point of the entire situation. And somewhere in the city of Tucson, Ethan Kell was moving. She thought about that while they walked. Kell moving. Kell, who had sat across from her at planning tables and handed her coffee, and who had known her operational identity so thoroughly that he could construct a false record using her name and expect it to be believed. Who had known which patients to route through the hospital. Who had the contacts to bring in a ghost surgeon under a fabricated credential and have that surgeon's work entered into a functioning medical record system without triggering any alert. That last part was the piece she kept returning to. The record system. The modification. The hospital's internal IT structure was managed by a contracted services company. She had never paid much attention to it, because why would she? Because it had nothing to do with nursing. But she knew the company's name because it was on the badge of every technician who came to update the ward terminals or troubleshoot the scheduling software. Paragon Health Systems Integration. She had seen that badge dozens of times in 22 months. She had never thought about it. She thought about it now. She stopped in the middle of the corridor. Hale stopped 2 steps later and turned. "The IT contractor," she said. He waited. "Paragon Health Systems Integration. They manage the hospital's internal network." She looked at him. If someone needed back-end access to the nursing assignment records, not staff-level access, administrative level, they would need either a Paragon credential or someone inside Paragon. Hale had his phone out before she'd finished. She followed him into the briefing room. Voss looked up from her laptop with the expression of someone who had continued working through the silence and had therefore accumulated more information, and more of it was bad. "I was about to call you," she said. "Paragon Health Systems Integration," Hale said. "Who are they?" Voss turned her laptop. "I pulled the contract when you were in Ward C. Paragon has been the IT services contractor for Harlow for 3 years. They won the contract through standard procurement, clean bid, references checked out, no flags." She highlighted a section of the contract document. "The parent company is a holding group called Statford Applied Services, incorporated in Virginia. A Virginia holding company with a medical IT subsidiary running the internal network of a federal military hospital." "Statford," Claire said. "It cross-references to 2 other contracts in the defense sector," Voss said. "One is a data management contract with the logistics office in Maryland. The other—" She stopped. She looked at the screen for a moment as if giving herself one more chance to have misread it. "The other is a security consulting contract. Client is listed as redacted, but the authorization code on the procurement document is traceable to a specific office within the defense intelligence structure." She looked up at Hale. "It's your office, sir." Statford Applied Services has a consulting contract with your intelligence division. The room went very quiet. Hale set his phone down on the table. He set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing the impulse to throw it. That contract, he said. I need to know who authorized it. I need the name on the authorization. I'm pulling it, Voss said. How long? 2 minutes. He nodded. He didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table with both hands on its surface and looked at the map of Tucson that was still on Voss's laptop from earlier, and Claire could see him working through the architecture of it in real time, the way it connected, the way the pieces had been positioned. Statford running Paragon, running the hospital's IT network. Statford with a consulting contract inside Hale's own intelligence division. Kell is the intelligence liaison who had access to both the operational framework and the administrative channels that could make things appear and disappear in records systems. It wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something more mundane and therefore more durable, a set of business relationships that created access, managed by a person with the patience to wait and the discipline not to overextend. Until something forced his hand. The incident report, Claire said. 4 months ago. Where did it go when I filed it? Hale looked at her. I flagged the anomaly and it went up the chain, she said. In this hospital, that means it went to the charge physician, who would have routed it to the medical director, who would have routed it to the administrative office for classified patient matters. She paused. Where does the administrative office for classified patient matters send documentation that involves a potential security concern? Hale said slowly, to the Defense Intelligence Liaison assigned to the facility. She looked at him. The liaison assigned to Harlow, he said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that meant he'd arrived at it. For the past 3 years, the intelligence liaison for this facility has been Kell, she said. He buried the report, Hale said. He received it, flagged it as routine administrative noise, and closed it without escalation. It never went above him. Which is why no one else knew, she said. Which is why the network kept running. He was the safety valve. Every time anything in this building got close to what they were doing, it landed on his desk and stopped there. Voss said, authorization name on the Statford consulting contract. They both looked at her. Major Ethan Kell, she said. He signed the contract 18 months ago, acting under a delegated authorization from a senior officer. She pulled up the document. The senior officer's signature is a rubber stamp. It's a standard delegation instrument, the kind that goes through without individual review. Kell would have had the authority to sign it himself as long as the dollar amount stayed below a certain threshold. Which it did, Hale said. Which it did, Voss confirmed. He straightened up from the table. I need to call the Inspector General's office, he said. This has gone past what I can manage through my own chain. If Kell has a consulting contract running through my division, I cannot guarantee the integrity of anyone above me who might have been in contact with Statford. It was the most honest thing she had heard a senior officer say in a long time, and she appreciated it without saying so. Before you make that call, she said, I need 20 minutes. He looked at her. The device that was retrieved from 312's shoulder, she said. Wherever it went, it was supposed to leave this building. It didn't. Otherwise, they wouldn't still be running operations against this facility. It's somewhere on these grounds. She held his eyes. I spent 22 months in this building. If something was hidden here, I want to find it before we open this to a wider investigation that gives anyone else a reason to come in and manage the evidence. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 20 minutes. She moved. The logic of it was simple once she accepted the premise. The device had been removed from the patient in room 312 11 days ago by a ghost surgeon under a false credential. The ghost surgeon had left, but the device, whatever it contained, whatever data or material it represented, had not followed the normal disposal pathway, because there was no real documentation of what had been removed, and therefore no tracked disposal chain. It was in the building, uncollected, waiting. The question was where someone in a hurry would put something small and valuable and retrievable in a hospital they had access to but did not permanently occupy. She thought about the relay transmitter in the equipment shed. Timer-based. set to run on a schedule that didn't require a human operator to be present, built to function autonomously within a defined window. Whatever the device was, it needed to be collectible on short notice, by someone who could come into the hospital without raising flags, who had a reason to be there, like a federal compliance auditor, like a man in a gray suit with stolen HHS credentials, standing outside the wrong patient's room while actually watching. What? What was he watching? Not room 307. That was the misdirection that had worked on all of them for the first several minutes. He had been watching 307, but he had come in through the Ward C entrance, and the Ward C entrance was adjacent to... She stopped in the middle of the corridor. The supply alcove. The locked supply alcove at the entrance to Ward C, where medications, equipment, and disposables were stored between restocking cycles. Where she had personally restocked the IV supply drawers 48 hours ago, before any of this had started. Where the internal waste disposal unit for the ward was located. The sealed biohazard container that was collected twice a week by the medical waste service. She was moving again before the thought finished. The supply alcove was locked with a keypad code that changed monthly. She entered the current code and pushed the door open. The alcove was narrow, 6 feet wide, 10 feet deep, shelving on both walls, waste disposal unit at the far end. She had been in it so many times that she navigated it without looking at the shelves. She went directly to the biohazard disposal unit. It was a sealed container, sealed lid, sealed access, the kind that required a key from the contracted waste service to open. The last scheduled collection had been 48 hours ago, which meant the unit had been empty at the start of the current cycle. She crouched in front of it. There was a scratch on the lock housing that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. Fresh metal, bright silver against the matte black of the housing, the kind of mark made by a key that had been used in a hurry or by someone who wasn't entirely familiar with the lock mechanism. She sat back on her heels. Someone had opened the biohazard unit after the last collection. They had put something inside it, and the man in the gray suit had been standing in this corridor, had come into this ward specifically with a reason that everyone, including Claire, had interpreted as aimed at room 307, when the actual destination was 12 feet away from where he'd been standing. She called Hale on the radio. "Supply alcove, Ward C entrance," she said. "Bring Voss and bring an evidence kit." They were there in 4 minutes. Hale looked at the scratch on the lock housing. He looked at Claire. "Can you open it?" she asked. He took the master key from the ring on his belt, the one that had come with his authorization for facility access the previous night, and tried it in the lock. It was not the right key. He tried a second one from the ring, the lid unsealed. Inside the biohazard unit, under a layer of standard medical waste that had accumulated over the past 48 hours, in a sealed specimen bag that was not the hospital's standard specimen bag, a commercial bag, the kind available at any pharmacy, was a small metallic object approximately the size of a thumb drive. It was not a thumb drive. Voss photographed it in place before anyone touched it. Then she put on gloves and lifted it out carefully and held it under the alcove's light. "Data storage," she said. "Military grade, encrypted housing. The retrieval port is a custom interface. Not standard USB, not standard anything." She turned it over. "This is not commercial hardware." "What does it store?" Hale said. "I can't tell you without the interface," she said. "But based on the housing spec, this holds somewhere between 50 and 200 gigabytes, encrypted." She paused. "For an object this size, that storage capacity suggests it's not operational data. It's a record." "A record of what?" Claire said. Voss looked at her. "At a guess?" "Everything. Transactions, communications, asset movements, financial transfers. The kind of record that a network operator keeps as insurance against the people he works with." She set it in the evidence bag with the deliberateness of someone handling something they were very aware could change multiple lives. Someone built a file, a complete file, and they embedded it in a courier's shoulder and ran it through this hospital to move it from one place to another, and something went wrong with the handoff. "Raskov," Claire said. Hale looked at her. "Raskov built the file," she said. "He's been building it for years. Insurance, like Voss said, against Kel, against whoever else is in the network. People at levels we haven't identified yet." She looked at the evidence bag. "He was moving it out of the country, through this hospital, but the handoff at the other end failed, and the device stayed in the building, and when he realized it hadn't come out, he needed it back, Hale said, badly enough to attack a military hospital. Badly enough to expose an entire operation that had been running invisibly for 20 months, she said. Yes. The three of them stood in the supply alcove with the evidence bag between them and the weight of what was inside it distributed evenly across the space. This ends the network, Voss said quietly. If the file is what I think it is, this ends all of it. It also ends Kell, Hale said, and anyone above Kell who's in there. He said it with the particular steadiness of someone who had accepted in advance that the number might be significant, and that the fallout was going to be significant, and that he was going to do it anyway. Claire looked at the device in its evidence bag and thought about the surgeon who didn't exist, and the records that had her name on them, and the 20 months of classified patients moving through her ward while she updated charts and checked IV lines and sat with Darren Polk at 3 a.m. because he couldn't sleep. They had used her ward, her patients, her floor, the place she had built something careful and real and quiet, the thing she had made for herself when she stopped being what she used to be. They had run an active covert operation through the middle of it, and they had put her name on the records when they needed a fall person, and they had sent an attack team through the building when they needed her gone. She felt it, fully, for the first time since the night before. Not the cold management of the crisis, but the actual human reality of it, the thing underneath the tactics and the analysis, the violation of it, the specific ugliness of having the life you had built used against you by people who had assumed you were too invisible to notice. She let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she said, "We need to move. Kell knows the attack failed. He knows the man in the gray suit has been picked up. He's going to calculate that the device has been found, and when he calculates that, he's going to run." "We have the airports flagged," Hale said. "He won't use an airport," she said. "He trained with us. He knows every flag we'd put on the standard routes." She thought, "He'll use a ground route, a prepared exit. He would have built one the moment he activated this operation, because he's careful, and he's been doing this long enough to know that operations fail." She looked at Hale. "He has a car, and a route, and a destination that we haven't identified yet, and he's been moving since this morning." "Then we need him to stop moving," Hale said. "Yes." "What makes him stop?" She looked at the evidence bag. "He stops if he thinks there's still something here worth stopping for," she said. "If he believes the device hasn't been found. If he thinks the retrieval is still possible." Voss understood it before Hale did. Claire could see it in her face. "You want to put it back." "Not the device," Claire said. "Something that looks like the device. And we let the relay transmitter in the equipment shed keep running on its schedule." She looked at Hale. "When the next transmission window opens, the one that Raskov or Kell or whoever is monitoring is waiting for, we send a status message." "On their frequency," Hale said. "On their frequency. A clean signal, 4 words." She thought for a moment. "Package is in place." Hale looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the evidence bag. He looked at the map of Tucson that was still in his mind from the briefing room, with the 2-mile radius around the hospital and the rental property that had been abandoned and the vehicle that had been making passes. "If Kell gets that message," he said slowly, "he doesn't run. He waits for an opportunity to retrieve. And we control the retrieval," she said, "and we bring him in. And we bring in whoever he contacts to make the attempt," she said, "because he won't try it himself. He's not going to walk back into this building. He'll send someone, and that someone will lead us to him." Hale said, "That's a significant operational risk." "Yes," she said. "If he figures out the signal is fabricated—" "He's gone," she said. "I know." Hale was quiet for long enough that the hospital sounds came back into the foreground. The ventilation system, the distant PA, the particular ambient rhythm of a building that was still functioning under extraordinary pressure. "You realize," he said, "that if this works, you've just run a full intelligence operation from the inside of a medical supply closet." "Don't make it sound impressive," she said. "It's just pattern recognition." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "I'll need 40 minutes to set the transmission up correctly," Voss said. "The frequency has to be exact or it'll flag as a spoof." "Do it," Hale said. They left the supply alcove. Hale carried the evidence bag. Claire stayed a moment longer, looking at the space. The shelves she had restocked dozens of times, the waste unit that she had never once thought about as anything other than what it was, the keypad lock she'd entered 1,000 times without examining the housing. She turned off the alcove light and closed the door. In the briefing room over the next 40 minutes, Voss built the transmission with the precision of someone who understood that imprecision would end this faster than any alternative, and Hale made 2 calls, one to the Inspector General's office and one to a number he dialed from memory that he didn't explain. Claire sat at the table and wrote down, from memory, every classified admission she could reconstruct, dates, approximate patient descriptions, the staff members she had seen on those shifts, the observations she'd filed and the ones she hadn't filed because they hadn't seemed significant at the time. She wrote it longhand because she didn't want it in a system that Statford had any access to. 11 pages. Voss's transmission went out at 1:47 p.m. 4 words, on the correct frequency, through the relay transmitter in the equipment shed. Packages in place. Then they waited. The waiting was the part that was hardest. Hale paced, which was something she had never seen him do before. Voss monitored the relay transmitter's receive log with the focus of someone who had decided that blinking was optional. Claire made coffee, because it was something to do, and because the coffee was bad and focusing on how bad it was kept her present in the room rather than running scenarios. At 2:34 p.m., the transmitter received a signal. Voss was on her radio before the signal finished. Incoming burst, 42 seconds, logging now. They all looked at the laptop screen. The signal decoded through Voss's software in under a minute. It was a response, short, encoded in the same structure as the outgoing message. Voss read it. She read it again. She looked up at Claire and then at Hale with an expression that had moved past professional into something that was briefly and genuinely shaken. "It's not from Kell," she said. Hale said, "What?" "The response signature," Voss said. "The encryption architecture on this signal is different from the relay transmitter's base architecture. It's not from the same operator." She turned the laptop. "This signal originated from a source that has higher-level encryption than anything Kell has access to." She pointed to a line in the decoded metadata. "This routing structure. I've seen this before. This is what the original 2021 network looked like, before the nodes were closed." Claire set her coffee down. "Raskov," she said. "Not Kell," Voss said. "Raskov directly. He's monitoring this channel himself." She looked at Claire. "He responded. He's in range." The room was still. "He's in Tucson," Claire said. Not a question. Hale was already on his radio calling the perimeter team, and Claire was already looking at the response message that Voss had decoded and laid out on the screen, and she was reading it, and the words were simple and brief and direct, and they landed with the weight of everything that had been building since 2:17 a.m. the previous night. The decoded response read, "Tell her I'm ready to finish this. Bring her to me or I will finish it myself." Claire read the message twice and then set it down with the same deliberateness she used when setting down something breakable. Hale had his radio to his mouth and was coordinating the perimeter expansion before she finished reading. She could hear him naming intersections, calling in vehicle descriptions, pulling his people from the hospital's inner perimeter toward the streets outside. The controlled, efficient sound of someone managing a situation that had just expanded in scope. She understood all of that. She let it happen around her. What she was doing was thinking about the specific word Raskov had used. Her. "Tell her I'm ready to finish this." He knew her name, her real name, not the cover, because Kell had given it to him. He knew what she looked like because someone had photographed her from a parking garage for 5 months. He knew she was the person who had stopped his team in the 3rd-floor corridor because the surviving members of that team had reported back before they were collected. And his response to all of that was not to run harder. It was to invite her to come to him, which meant one of 2 things. Either he was confident enough in his position that he believed he could control the outcome of a direct confrontation, or he was calculating that the threat of independent action, finishing it himself, was enough leverage to make Hale hand her over rather than risk whatever that independent action looked like. Both of those calculations assumed she was a variable being managed by someone else. That was the error. "Marcus," she said. Hale lowered his radio. "He's not going to hit the hospital again," she said. "He sent that message because he wants to pull us off the grounds. He wants us chasing the threat he's dangled so that someone can come back here for the device." Hale looked at her. "We already have the device." "He doesn't know that. He thinks the transmission was real. He thinks the package is still in place." She looked at the decoded message on Voss's screen. "He's running 2 plays simultaneously. The message is bait. While we redirect resources to find him, his actual retrieval attempt comes through the back." Hale was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he got back on his radio and reversed half the perimeter reassignments he'd just made. Voss was watching Claire with an expression that had settled into something that was not quite admiration and not quite unease, but lived in the territory between them. "If he has a second team staged," Voss said, "and we've already pulled our inner cordon—" "We haven't pulled all of it," Hale said. 2 units stay on the building, 2 go wide." He looked at Claire. "What's his entry point?" "Not the main entrance, not the service yard. We hit that already and he knows it." She went through the building in her head the way she had learned to go through terrain, methodically, without assumptions. The east wing is still partially compromised from the generator explosion. The structural assessment hasn't been completed. That section is closed to hospital staff, but it hasn't been formally sealed. Anyone with a blueprint and 20 minutes of prep could come through the east wing without meeting a single checkpoint. "I'll put people on the east access," Hale said. "Visible people," she said. "Put them where someone approaching from outside can see them. Make it look like the east wing is the one place that's covered." He understood. "And the actual coverage?" "Interior, 2nd floor east corridor junction. If they get through the wing, they'll come up the stairwell at the junction. It's the only route from the east entry to Ward C that doesn't pass through a checkpoint." She looked at him. "Put your 2 best people there and make sure they're not visible from the stairwell approach." He was already moving. The next 90 minutes were the specific kind of difficult that didn't announce itself as difficult. It looked, from outside the briefing room, like a hospital operating under elevated security protocols. Staff moving purposefully, additional personnel in the corridors, the controlled tension of a facility that had been through something and hadn't finished processing it yet. Normal enough to be plausible, tight enough to be functional. Inside the briefing room, Claire sat across from Voss and worked through the 11 pages she'd written longhand, adding timestamps and cross-referencing against the admission records Voss had pulled, building a documented account of what had been running through Ward C that was independent of any system Statford could touch. It was painstaking work. Her handwriting was not good under normal circumstances and was worse when she'd been awake for more than 30 hours. She made errors and crossed them out and rewrote. She left gaps where she wasn't certain and labeled them as gaps rather than filling them with approximations, because the gaps were honest and an approximation was not. At 3:52 p.m., Hale's radio produced a transmission from the interior team on the 2nd floor east junction. "Movement in the east stairwell, single individual, moving up, not in hospital attire." Hale keyed back. "Hold position. Wait for confirmation of intent." 20 seconds of silence. Then, "Individual has stopped on the 2nd floor landing. He's looking at something, a phone maybe. He's typing." Voss pulled up the relay transmitter log. "Nothing incoming on the frequency." "Different channel," Claire said. "He's checking in on a separate line." "Colonel," the interior team said. "Individual is moving again. He's coming toward the junction." Hale said, "Take him when he clears the stairwell door." 4 seconds. "Secure," the interior team said. Hale exhaled once, quietly. Claire heard it from across the table. The individual taken in the east stairwell was a man in his early 30s, no identification, carrying a key that matched the biohazard unit in the Ward C supply alcove and a commercial specimen bag identical to the one the device had been stored in. His phone contained 2 recent messages, both sent within the last hour, both using a different relay structure from the equipment shed transmitter, to an address that Voss was able to partially decode within 20 minutes. The partial decode was enough. The address resolved to a self-storage facility on the south side of Tucson, 7 miles from the hospital. Hale was on the phone to the Inspector General's team, who had been staged and waiting since his first call 3 hours earlier, with the address before the ink was dry on Voss's printout. He did not ask Claire if she wanted to go. She appreciated that. Because the honest answer was complicated, and she didn't have the energy for complicated. What she felt, sitting in the briefing room while Hale coordinated the response to an address 7 miles away, was not the urgency she would have felt 24 hours ago. It was something quieter, not detachment. She had never been good at detachment, which was something she'd been told was a professional weakness and had privately disagreed with for years. Just the recognition that some things were going to happen without her, and that was not the same as losing. Raskov was at the storage facility. The IG team found him there 40 minutes later, not running, which surprised some of the people involved and did not surprise Claire. He had been in the self-storage unit, working on a laptop connected to an encrypted satellite uplink when they came through the door. He made no attempt to destroy the laptop. He made no attempt to resist. He sat in a folding chair in the middle of a 10 by 15 storage unit, surrounded by the infrastructure of 3 years of operational management, and looked at the people who came through the door with the particular expression of someone who had known, at some level, that this was eventually how it ended. The laptop contained 2 years of communications, financial records, the complete network map, in a format that was organized and indexed, the kind of thing that a careful and experienced operator maintains not out of sloppiness, but out of the quiet knowledge that documentation is leverage, and leverage is the only currency that survives everything else. It also contained Ethan Kell's full operational file. Every instruction, every payment, every asset Kell had routed through Harlow and the facilities that had preceded it, every communication between them going back to 2020, the year before the operation that had ended with 2 of Claire's teammates not coming home. The IG team called Hale with the preliminary inventory at 5:30 p.m. He came into the briefing room and told Claire what they had found, and he told her about the 2020 communications, and she sat with that for a moment without responding. "Kell," she said. "There's a location ping on his phone," Hale said. "He's been moving southeast since this morning. The IG team has him in the New Mexico corridor. They'll have him before morning." She nodded. "Claire," she looked at him. "The 2020 file," he said carefully. "It has Kell's instructions to Raskov about your team's operational timeline. It has the date, the specific information he passed." He paused. "It's enough." She understood what he was saying, enough to prove what she had known for 3 years but couldn't demonstrate. The thing that had sent her running, that had made her bury herself in a military hospital in Tucson and spend 22 months learning the sleep positions of veterans and the medication schedules of strangers, and the name of Darren Polk's daughter. Enough to give the last 3 years a verdict. She looked at her hands on the table, the 11 handwritten pages beside them. "Okay," she said. It was not a satisfying word for the moment. It was the word she had, and she used it because she was 34 years old and she had been carrying this since she was 31. And the thing that happened when you had been carrying something for 3 years and it was finally done was not a dramatic release. It was more like setting down a bag you'd stopped noticing the weight of. The absence of the weight was there, but it took a minute to register as real. Hale sat down across from her for the first time since the early morning, and they stayed in the quiet room together while the hospital ran its evening shift outside the door. Kell was arrested at 4:17 a.m. the following morning at a gas station outside Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was alone. He had a bag in the back of his car with $60,000 in cash and 3 passports in different names, which told the story of his exit plan more clearly than any communication intercept could. He did not resist arrest. He said nothing at the scene except to ask for an attorney. The arresting officers noted later that he looked tired. Not scared, not angry, just tired in the way of someone who had been running a long time and was not entirely sorry to stop. Within 72 hours of his arrest, the Statford Applied Services contract with the Defense Intelligence Division had been suspended pending investigation. Captain Lena Ferris was placed on administrative leave pending review of the Meridian Fleet contracts. The ghost surgeon whose credential, P. Garrow, had been used to falsify the procedure in room 312 was identified through the IG's communication intercepts as a former military physician who had been operating under Kell's direction for 18 months. He surrendered to federal marshals in Phoenix 3 days after Kell's arrest. The nursing assignment records that carried Claire's name were forensically examined by the IG's Digital Forensics Unit, who confirmed within 48 hours that the entries had been created using an administrative-level credential belonging to a Paragon Health Systems integration employee who was subsequently identified, interviewed, and arrested. The employee had been paid through a financial instrument that traced, through 4 intermediary accounts, to a Statford subsidiary. Every thread that had been woven into the records of Harlow Veterans Medical Center over 20 months was pulled, and the pulling was methodical and documented and visible, conducted not quietly, not behind closed language, but through a formal investigative process that produced public arrest records and filed charges and federal court dates. It was not clean. It was never going to be clean. The IG's investigation generated 94 separate evidentiary items in the first week and involved 3 federal agencies and 2 congressional oversight notifications, and a process that would take, by the IG's own estimate, 18 months to fully resolve. But it was real. It was moving. And Claire's name, or her real name, the name under which she had served, the name that had been buried under cover designations and false records and 3 years of deliberate invisibility, was cleared of the false nursing assignment entries by official written determination within 4 days. She was in the hospital when the determination came through. She was on Ward C, on the night shift, because when Hale had asked her what she wanted to do in the immediate aftermath, she had said she wanted to finish her shift. He had stared at her. She had meant it. Danny Ruiz was at the nurse's station when she came back on the floor that first night. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent 2 days processing an enormous amount of information and arrived at a place that was still largely bewildered, but had decided that bewilderment was an acceptable operating condition. "So," he said. "So," she said. "You were, all of that. You were a nurse," she said, "on the night shift, same as you." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "That's not actually all you were." "No," she said, "it's not." He absorbed this, nodded slowly with the particular nodding of someone filing it under things they would think about later. "Okay, Morez needs his 2,200 meds and Polk's been asking for you." "I'll start with Polk," she said. She went to room 307. She knocked. She always knocked, which was a habit from years ago that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the simple respect of it, and pushed the door open. Darren Polk was awake. He was sitting up in bed in the way of someone who had been awake for a while and had been doing something quiet with the time. He looked at her when she came in, and his face did the thing it did when he was trying to decide whether to say something or let it go. He decided to say something. "It was you," he said. "That night. The whole thing." "Some of it," she said. "The people in the corridor." She checked his vitals chart without answering, which he knew from experience meant yes. "You've been here 2 years," he said. "Almost." "And the whole time I was the night shift nurse," she said, who also happened to have a different previous career. She made a note on his chart. "How are you sleeping?" "Better than I should be, probably." He watched her write. "Lily called this morning." "Good." "I didn't tell her anything." "That's probably right," she said. "She'd worry." "She would." Claire capped the pen. "You're doing well. Another week, maybe 10 days. And then? And then you go home and you call Lily from there instead of here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for the other night, for whatever you did." She looked at him. He was 46 years old and had 2 deployments and a medevac and a daughter who called on Sundays and a way of crying quietly that he thought no one saw. He was, like most of the people who ended up in this ward, a person who had given something real and gotten hurt for it and was working his way back. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I wanted to." She turned off the overhead light and left the bedside lamp on, the way he preferred, and went back out to the corridor. Voss came to the hospital 6 days after the arrest to take Claire's formal statement for the IG's record. They sat in the same briefing room where most of the critical decisions of the previous week had been made, and Voss recorded 12 hours of testimony over 2 days, and the statement covered everything from the 2021 operation and the 2 teammates who hadn't come home to the incident report 4 months ago to the night of the attack, to the relay transmitter in the equipment shed, to the evidence bag in the biohazard unit. On the second day, toward the end of the session, Voss set down her pen and said, without the official recorder running, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Claire said. "The 2 years here," Voss said. "You were hiding, but you were also actually doing the job, actually caring about those patients." "Yes," Claire said again. Both things were true simultaneously. "Yes." Voss thought about this. Most people in your position would have kept more distance, not let it be real. Most people, Claire said, haven't spent enough time in combat medicine to know that distance is a theory. She looked at the table. You think you can care about the work without caring about the people, and you're wrong every time. The work is the people. If you're not letting it be real, you're not actually doing it. Voss nodded slowly, in the way of someone storing something. Dr. Vanessa Cole came to the briefing room on the third day, alone, without being asked. She knocked and came in and sat across from Claire with her hands folded on the table and the cut above her eyebrow healed to a thin line. She said, "I've been thinking about what I said to you, before all of this, during your performance review." "You don't need to," Claire started. "I told you that you went quiet when things got loud," Vanessa said. "I meant it as a criticism. I was wrong." Claire waited. "You weren't going quiet," Vanessa said. "You were listening. There's a difference, and I should have known it, and I didn't." She paused. "I think I mistook stillness for weakness for a long time. I run loud because I learned that loud projects competence. You run quiet because you learned that quiet gives you information." She stopped again, as if she'd prepared this and was now unsure about the ending. "I'm not sure my way is better." "It's not worse," Claire said. "It's different. Loud gets things moving fast. That matters in a trauma bay. And quiet? Quiet catches things loud misses." She looked at Vanessa directly. "A good floor needs both." Vanessa Cole did not apologize again because she was not that kind of person, and Claire had never needed her to be. What she did instead was extend a professional courtesy that, in the language of how Vanessa operated, meant more than an apology would have. She asked, formally, if Claire intended to remain on staff, and when Claire said yes, she said she was glad, and she said it plainly and without qualification. Hale came on the 7th day. He came in civilian clothes, which was the signal that he was there as himself rather than in his official capacity. And he sat across from Claire in the hospital cafeteria with 2 cups of coffee. Better coffee than the hallway machine, which was a low bar but still a bar. And he looked at her for a moment before speaking. "The IG has formally requested your operational reinstatement," he said. "Retroactive restoration of record. Full clearance reinstatement. Your previous designation, your service history, the 2021 operation, all of it restored and declassified to the extent possible." She looked at her coffee. "And the 2 teammates," she said. "Their records are being corrected," he said. "Posthumously. It won't fix anything. I know that." "No," she said, "but it's right." He nodded. "There's also a formal request for your operational availability," he said. "You'd be assigned as a training specialist, trauma and field medicine, working with pre-deployment combat medic units, based here in Tucson if you want to stay, or here," she said. He looked up. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I live here." He almost said something, decided against it, picked up his coffee instead. "The training position is yours if you want it," he said. No pressure, no timeline. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "Yes." "Yes?" "Yes, Marcus, I'll take the position." She looked at him. "I've been taking care of people who come back from the field for 2 years. I'd like to help them be more prepared before they go." He nodded. Something settled in his face that had been unresolved for several days. They drank their coffee in the cafeteria of Harlow Veterans Medical Center, which smelled of disinfectant and burnt toast and was lit with the fluorescent persistence of institutional spaces everywhere. And outside the windows, the Tucson afternoon was doing what Tucson afternoons did in late summer, blazing with the kind of heat that stopped being surprising after the first month and just became the weather. She stayed on the night shift through the remainder of the week because the work didn't stop and the patients didn't stop needing care because the world outside the ward had gone complicated. On the 6th night, Darren Polk was discharged. He came to the nurse's station before he left, which she hadn't expected, and he stood there with his bag over his shoulder in civilian clothes looking like himself rather than like a patient, which always required a moment of adjustment. "Call Lily from home," she said. "Already planned," he said. He extended his hand. She shook it. He left. She watched him go through the ward C door and listened to his footsteps fade down the main corridor, and thought about the fact that he was walking without a limp, which 2 months ago had not been certain, and that he would call his daughter on Sunday from a living room instead of a hospital bed. That was the work. That had always been the work. Everything else had been circumstances around it. 3 weeks after Kell's arrest, she stood in front of a room of 14 pre-deployment combat medics at the Harlow Training Annex. They were young, younger than she remembered being at their age, which was probably not accurate but felt true. And they were watching her with the attentive wariness of people who had been told they were getting a specialist instructor and were trying to calibrate their expectations. She looked at them for a moment without speaking, which she had learned long ago was a more effective opening than anything she could say in the first sentence. Then she said, "You're going to go places where the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one is about 30 seconds of correct decision-making under conditions that your brain was not designed to handle. Everything I'm going to teach you is aimed at those 30 seconds, not the minutes before or after. Those 30 seconds. A young woman in the front row, 19, maybe 20, with the kind of posture that came from recent basic training, raised her hand. "What do we do if the scenario doesn't match anything we train for?" Claire looked at her. "You use what you have," she said. "That's the whole answer. It's also the hardest thing you'll ever do, because what you have is never going to feel like enough. It's not going to feel like enough when you're in it, and you're going to do it anyway." She paused. "The goal isn't to feel ready," she said. "The goal is to be ready. They're not the same thing, and confusing them will cost you." She moved to the board at the front of the room. "Let's start with triage under impaired visibility, because that's where most people lose 30 seconds they can't get back." She picked up the marker. She had spent 14 years learning things the hard way, and 3 years pretending she hadn't learned them, and 22 months using them quietly, in the dark, for people who didn't know they needed them. She was done pretending. The room was quiet and attentive. Outside the windows, the desert morning was doing what desert mornings did, beginning hot and getting hotter, indifferent to the plans of the people under it, reliable in the way that only indifferent things can be. Claire Whitmore stood at the front of the room and taught, and she was not gentle about it, and she was not especially loud, and she did not make it feel easier than it was. She made it feel possible, which was the only thing that mattered. The woman who had spent 3 years hiding her strength had spent those same 3 years sharpening it without realizing it, in the way she tracked the footsteps of patients who couldn't sleep, in the way she read a room the moment she entered it, in the way she caught the things others didn't look for because they hadn't learned to look. Strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait to be recognized. It does its work in the margins, in the night shifts, in the 30-second windows when everyone else is still deciding what to do. And when the moment comes, it's already there.